My name is Gabrielle Strobel. I'm executive editor of ALS Forum, so I'm a science journalist. Unlike most of you, I'm delighted to moderate this discussion about data sharing. It's a great time to revisit this topic or to think about this topic as so many big data initiatives are forming in various disease fields, from the precision medicine initiatives, the 100,000 Genomes Project, and many others really that are trying to bring a lot of data together and maybe even connect them to electronic health records or clinical or other phenotypic records to accelerate discovery in genetics and then the mechanisms of disease. So it's a wonderful time for experts in dementia to think about how our field can use our resources to, or build resources to advance here. And I also encourage everyone who might have expertise from other fields, schizophrenia, diabetes, either because you work there or have heard about it, to contribute your view of how data sharing has affected those fields. Maybe we in dementia can learn from that. About our panel, I will read some of the intros because I couldn't possibly remember all of it. Valentia Escott-Price is a professor at the Dementia Research Institute, UKDRI. She's at the School of Medicine at the University of Cardiff, and she uses her education in mathematics and statistics, programming, and expertise in biostatistics and genetics to really do integrative analysis to glean biological meaning from basic genetic data. It's a rare, very sought-after skill nowadays, as everyone is trying to wrestle these big data sets that we're accumulating. So her recent work on the PG polygenic risk scores is generating quite a bit of discussion in the field, as we've talked about before. And she is increasingly well recognized for her expertise there. Dr. Sobia Raza is head of science at the PhD Foundation, a health policy organization with a special focus on how genomics and other emerging health technologies can provide more effective, personalized healthcare and deliver health improvements for patients and citizens. So her expertise is super important as we discuss how this expertise can be translated to policy, but also communities that need to use it and communicate complicated concepts such as risk effectively and safely. Sobia leads the Foundation's work on genomic data sharing. She provides analysis and insight into a range of data-related topics and engages with clinical, scientific, and biomedical communities to explore issues around the effective use of data for healthcare. She earned her PhD and MSc at the University of Edinburgh, where she stayed after her postdoc. And while there, seconded to the Scottish Parliament to provide independent insight into a range of science and health-related topics. Nick Fox, I think probably needs no introduction to most of you in the audience, is a professor of clinical neurology and director of the Dementia Research Center at UCL's Institute of Neurology, and consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, Queen Square. Nick runs the Specialist Cognitive Disorders Clinic there and has a long-standing clinical research interest in young onset and familial dementias. Studied dementia for over 20 years and developed techniques for tracking atrophy over time that is very widely used in observational studies and clinical trials, and serves on many steering committees. And maximize time, because I think you probably know most of this. I'll just add that Nick also has this special empathy in how he relates to his patients that enables the building of these observational cohort, because it encourages trust in patients. They come back over and over again for many years, and allows the building of these cohorts that are so rich in phenotypic data that make genetic data more meaningful as well. So without further ado, we will get started. I've been given a number of questions. I expect we'll get through 3 or 4 maybe at the pace that we were discussing before. I'll just start with one here. There is some concern when in data sharing discussions, genetic data sharing discussions, there's often concern expressed about the possibility of re-identification of participants in dementia genetic studies. It's about incomplete anonymization and algorithms, ways of combining publicly available data about a person with sequence of a person to discover whether a person is part of a study, for example, and might be part of the case group. There have been publications showing statistical ways of doing this, and then a lot of controversy. So in practice, how big of a problem is identification really? Has it happened? The first paper about it, I remember, came out in 2008, Ohm et al., and then there were a few more afterwards, and then there was a lot of controversy arguing points on both sides. So I think for our purposes in 2018, maybe we can look back and say, has this happened? Has this caused problems in genetics of dementia or other big diseases where scientists are building these large, shared, more available, more easily accessible databases? Because the warnings were taken seriously, even summary statistics were taken off certain websites. It's 10 years later. How big is the problem in reality? I'll first direct the question to the panel and then open it up to the audience.
Shall I start? So
yeah.
Colleagues of mine at the PhD Foundation have actually recently, this isn't a plug, but they've published a report on genomics and identification. This is, beyond just dementia, and essentially the findings are that, it's currently, it is possible. The chances of it are low. It requires a certain degree of technical expertise. So should we be concerned? I think that's a separate question, even if the risks currently are low, because I think just thinking about the wider discussion and dialogue and concerns the public have around genomic data sharing, whether they're founded or unfounded, is even if there is a very slim chance, if it does happen, there's the potential to undermine public trust. So I think, regardless of the probability, we need to be quite transparent with the public so that, currently the chances are small, but it's there. It's about transparency. On the second aspect, and I think concerns around there, it's the moving regulatory landscape. So in the UK, there's a new data protection bill that will be coming into force in May 2018 to enact the European General Data Protection Regulation. And that contains a provision restricting the unauthorized re-identification of de-identified personal data with a specific clause in there. So again, it's about having those conversations with the publics about, the developing regulatory landscape around there.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Well, what I'd like to start by saying, which is sounds a bit like a politician's answer, so I'm not going to answer your question, but I want to answer another question. I'll start with that. Is that I think most of the patients, I can send a lot of people into genetic research and they give their blood samples. And they go into clinical trials and they go into observational studies and they have brain scans. And I think in all those situations, they would be appalled if they thought that one researcher or one company would hold on to their data and not share it. So that's not quite your question, but it's a balance here, because I actually think there, with very few exceptions, most of my patients and people who go into studies would like their data, and they don't see these divides between one person's grant or one institution or one researcher. They just think, I'm going to help with research, and this doctor or this researcher asked me to do that, they explained it to me, and I want it to help everybody. So I think we have to balance that the vast majority of people really want that. What they have a concern about, rightly, would be if somebody was to contact them and give them information that they hadn't asked for. So when we can send people into research studies of genetics, there's a particular question in our standard consent which says, if something else was found, would you want to know I mean, I paraphrase it. Of course, it's written rather longer than that, but that's what I discuss with them. And some people say, of course I'd want to know. And some people say, absolutely, I wouldn't want to know. So I think the key thing about your question there is that people would like the data shared, and they would, I think, would take a certain level of risk over that. I think the main thing is to stop the deliberate de-identification and the deliberate contacting of people. And that can be very well-meaning. That can be well-meaning because I'd like you to go into my study, which would be helpful. And so I think I see that those are the things we need to really balance. Patients want their data used. Mm-hmm. They don't really care too much if there was a small chance that something got re-identified, but they don't want somebody to be deliberately contacting them and giving them information.
So would you solve that problem with a data use agreement, for example, or with erring on the side of safety and not sharing?
I think we should, again, we have to be transparent, and we have to, what matters is what patients consent to. And if we say in the consent that data will be shared, and those people who will have those data will be signing up to not to seek to find your identity, and that will be protected as best we can, I feel that would go a long way towards it.
Valentina?
And perhaps for me to add, it's two types of probably data sharing. One is the sharing data with public, just put it into internet and anyone could use it, then it could be abused. Then company could use it, I don't know, to calculate your chance of you developing Alzheimer's disease, use it for the insurance, I don't know, something like that. It's one aspect, but we are not talking about this at the moment. We are talking about data sharing within our scientific community, and that's for all means should be shared. And I think for years we are trying to work together and share data, and I haven't heard of any of scientists would actually abuse that information, or we are busy enough to analyze the data rather than go for a particular identity or particular people. So I think sharing within community, scientific community, absolutely yes. Sharing with general public is not of my area of expertise, but probably not.
And just to clarify, we're talking about two different kinds of sharing also in the sense that there's sharing of summary statistics, and then there's sharing of raw data, which is more sensitive and is more restricted.
Talking about summary statistics, I think it's widely accepted already, and it's shared quite easily. And it's not that easy to identify people from summary statistics. I thought that we are talking about raw data sharing, where you actually can identify people if you go for it. And yes, but I mean, raw data should be shared. From an analytical point of view, we do need data, full data, rather than work with summary statistics, which limits our ability to analyze the data, and which we have, as a data analyst, we come with some very rough estimates rather than exact answers and numbers. So yes, it should be shared.
Opening it up to the audience.
Well, maybe a short comment to the summary statistics. I think, like, especially in the scientific community, it might be general sense that this doesn't pose a big problem to share those also publicly, summary statistics. And we do this in our psychiatric genomics consortium for a very long time. But it's definitely not the whole field. And very clear, there are some, for example, company-like groups out there like 23andMe that make our work really, really difficult for that sense. So it's really not in the whole community there, and 23andMe, even if they're integrated in very big meta-analyses, they do not allow us to share the whole genome summary statistics. So it's a discussion that should be done still, even on the summary statistics level. And I totally agree with all the raw genotypes. Raw genotypes should never be public, that's for sure. But I personally love also this. So I think for the community, it makes a lot of sense to make these summary statistics public. I think this is an important step, because there's so many universities that they cannot go especially from the developing countries that cannot go with MTAs, blah, 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 but they still want to work with the data. And I love this public summary statistics level thing in there, but it's not the whole world who thinks like this, and it's really quite restricted more and more, unfortunately.
Alfredo Ramirez from University of Cologne here. I think following your comment there, I think there is one point that there is two things. One is what the patients would like to share, and they're keen to share their own thing, their own data, but I think the institutions where we work, they start doing a lot of rules and makes all this process so complicated. And I have been through this situation trying to get the data from different universities, and you have this materials transfer agreement that are full of different points that you have to fill. And if you ask the patient, actually, what he signed has nothing to do what you are actually asking for. And so I think those are two different points, and I think the problem we face with data sharing is more related to the institutions that we are facing for this sharing.
So I agree both with Sobia and Nick in that if we violate, or if even there's a perception that we violated the public trust, that's going to be destructive. At the same time, Nick, I totally agree. People that donate their sample and data want the data to be shared, and those two are not mutually exclusive. I mean, there are qualified access databases where you promise not to identify an individual, and I think if you look back and say nobody's done that, well, it's always prohibited. Every place I can get data, it's always prohibited from identifying an individual. So it's whether it's against national law or NIH law or MRC rules, whatever, it's always prohibited. So it hasn't happened, but if the public thinks it's happened, thinks it can happen, then that could be really destructive, particularly if, the consent form somebody signs says, I will not, put this up on YouTube. You have to respect that consent form. But qualified access databases, you can, if they're well run, and I bristle in sometimes, I agree that sometimes these MTAs or DTAs are horrible, and so you're much better off in a qualified access database, which is set up to deal with, so you don't have to deal with it. You deal with it once and give it to them, and then you promise to, when you get the data, you promise not to de-identify people. And there's teeth behind that, even if it's not public law, it's NIH rule. So data sharing is absolutely essential. Certain summary statistics are fine to put up, make publicly available. On the other hand, I bristle a little bit because I have 30 or 40 dbGaP applications. It did not kill me. Okay, when somebody says, oh, it's too much hassle, well, come on. It's not too much hassle to go through protection for people that have volunteered for research. But sharing is critical because the point of view is what I had never really thought about is when you sit there across the table and you sign a consent form, you're promising, well, I will not do this, I will not put it on the internet, I will not, and I'll protect your data. You also are promising them that you will use their data for research. And sharing is part of that promise. That was pointed out to me a while back. I'd never thought of that you are promising them that you will use their data for research. And that should include sharing with protection.
I just had a couple of comments on I think the points that have been raised. I think broadly in the general discourse around genomic data sharing, I think we rightly focus on the risks of sharing, the risks of de-identification, potential stigmatization, but I think equally as a research and healthcare community, it's quite important to also discuss the risks associated with not sharing sufficiently, also the opportunity costs with not sharing, and I think that's quite an important aspect of how we engage the general populace to appreciate the importance of data sharing. And then just on your last point, within at least UK healthcare, we have in the national health system in England, we have a national data guardian for health and care, and she essentially a few years ago came up with a series of principles around data sharing, and one was specifically, I think, aimed at some very overcautious behavior, and this is specific to healthcare, but people erring on the side of caution because of the risks around confidentiality and so on. But it's a principle that really hit home to me. The duty to share can be just as important as the duty to protect confidentiality, and a similar principle as we're hearing today should apply within research as well. When it comes to complex data sharing agreements and how those are navigated, it's important to remember the participants and the principal reasons why they've signed up to and agreed to contribute to research studies.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you say, Sobia. It reminds me of, if we think back in time, around the time of the Human Genome Project, some of you are presumably still analyzing data from samples that were collected around those years. Consent was viewed a bit differently there, because remember, we were worried that DNA sequences itself would be patented at a large scale and monetized directly. Celera was being founded, and nobody could foresee yet what a tremendous learning and advancement were to be had in sequencing the genomes of many, many people and having big databases. And the many variants that were found from that was not known at the time. So consent, you could maybe make an argument nowadays that consent given at the time was given with different thinking than today, where if you consent people today, would they want their blood sample or their genetic sequence to be not available to the companies that develop drugs against the diseases that afflicts their family? Because it's not the geneticist that consents them who will develop the drugs. That will end up being pharmaceutical companies, if we like it or not. So I think the concept of consent has changed from we don't want DNA to be monetized to maybe pharma companies who have discovery units that mine data should have access to large genetic databases too. Jerry.
Just while Jerry waits for the microphone, I want to pick up on your point, Jerry, because I think it's an interesting idea that we should, within ethics, almost be asking the researchers not just to do the research, but to maximize the research potential of things that patients donate. Because I think that's a sort of nice counterpoint to that. I do think that when we sit across from a patient and consent them, they do have faith in you, and they mainly don't read the consent forms properly. They just think, this is the practical reality of it. You go through it with them and they say, yeah, if you think it's fine, it's essentially that's implied. So they put trust in you, and they have trust that when you have the sample that you're not going to try and de-identify it, and that you have enough control over the people who work with you, that they won't do so. And so it's the protecting people like me when we delegate responsibility to somebody else, that you have faith in it. So that's where there have to be teeth, as you say, that you have to really trust that if you share data which could possibly lead to somebody being de-identified or approached, that you feel confident in doing that.
So just to Gabrielle's point, a consent form, when it's signed, you cannot violate that. So if they say this cannot be used by a commercial firm, it cannot be used by a commercial firm unless you go back and reconsent that person. You absolutely have to respect that. You cannot change that. And we're all going to be in big trouble if we actually start doing that. So that's just off the table.
Is anyone here? Yeah, I hear you. You can't just go over somebody's consent, even if it's old. Is anyone here aware of the Global Alliance for Genomic Health and the tools that they have been developing? I don't know the details, but I've followed sort of on the side that they are developing online tools. So this is this large alliance that deals with the data sharing issues and the many, many complexities that come with it and can't be discussed in an hour. And I think they have about 500 500 plus member organizations by now, and they're developing tools to deal with legacy consent, taking consent forward, consent across international boundaries, because they're often very different from country to country, and that's an obstacle to sharing. So I wonder if, the dementia genetics community could learn from other fields that have faced similar problems and have tried to find solutions to them. Is anyone on the panel or in the audience following what the Global Alliance for Genetic Health is doing? Yeah, okay, well, we can move on to the next question then. As an editor in the dementia field, I sometimes hear complaint that the consortia-based approach to genetics research funding and the data stewardship of genetic data and these qualified databases is well-intentioned, but is in effect creating systems of sort of walled gardens, or we all know the term of the selfish silo or the data fiefdom, which there's quite a bit of literature about this being argued on both sides, where the system serves to protect data privacy, but de facto restrict access or makes it very cumbersome to maybe promote control, holding on to the data longer. I know that's partially been solved, or protect senior authorship. There are many incentives that in academia that go against sharing and putting tremendous effort into sharing. Using the example of BRCA1, for example, Nature magazine ran an editorial in 2015 charging that lip service is being paid to data sharing, while privacy or data structure argument are used to avoid actually sharing. And that comes up occasionally. I wonder, what about our field? Is this a problem for us? Are we doing well? Can we do better?
Well, okay, so I'd say, Gabrielle, that I think it's whether it's the previous question or what you've just raised, I think it's often used as a smokescreen or a cloak for people to maintain control. And I think, I know that sounds a bit accusatory of my colleagues, but I think it's about making sure that people are truly properly acknowledged and get credit for what they've done, and not be restrictive and be too controlling. But maybe I'm being unfair. Interested in other people's views.
I think I'm not
Sobia.
dementia researcher, but it's a really pertinent question more broadly in the era of big data research, how we fairly share the benefits arising from data and data value, because there's an enormous onus on the data generator, the data curators, and often that can create disincentives to share. But we're also seeing a parallel and analogous scenarios now arising in other domains, including AI being one example. The machine learning algorithms, can't be refined unless there's big data in the first place. But how do you ensure that there's value across the system in the different stakeholders involved with those data sets? And I think there's possibly a lot to learn broadly from different disciplines in how data generators, curators are acknowledged and rewarded for their input.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
So I think we're all in agreement that we should be sharing data. I think everyone in the room agrees with that. I think we all agree as well that not everyone does it, as just mentioned. And I was wondering if the panel had any comments on how can we encourage people to share data. Do funding agencies need to mandate this? Do journals need to mandate this? Should we have a rule across the board that if you're publishing in genetics, your data must be publicly released as long as, of course, consent allows it? Just wondering if the panel has any thoughts on recommendations for something like this.
Again, there are two different types of data. Summary statistics, which I agree should be shared and eventually publicly, but I also think that it should be, as it exists now, a time limitation when people who generated summary statistic out of raw data also could use it to publish first, because it was not only resources and time and money spent to generate the data, but data analysis also requires lots of skills, knowledge, and efforts. So, and obviously, if we just put the data out straight away as we generate it, some people who are just waiting to download the data, they could do all sorts of with that, and much quicker sometimes, because different university structures have different number of bioinformaticians who could do it quickly. So yes, and I think it should be rather introduced by funding bodies rather than journals, because as soon as a journal, I think it is absolutely public. I don't know, but with funding bodies, we could, well, I think funding bodies should encourage it rather than journals.
So I think this is a perennial problem, the two problems of getting appropriate recognition and reward for the work that you do in science, and the second thing is the sharing of data and who makes people share data. There is a clause in a box on the Medical Research Council proposals, I think so too, the Wellcome Trust, that if you're funded, you are obliged to share the data within a certain period of time. I do think that not enough people complain to the funders and tell them, I have tried to get, and it doesn't matter whether it's a transgenic mouse or data about big data and so forth. If you don't complain, they don't do anything, and they don't do anything because nobody complains. And if it was ramped up a bit more, I think it would certainly make a difference. And I'm very surprised, in many years I've worked for the MRC, I've never seen any really serious complaints about this, and it seems to me a very strange thing. So the first point you brought up was about recognition and reward. I think that the Academy of Medical Sciences produced a very nice document a year or so ago on team science. And what it says is it's about time that people got recognition as individuals for what they do. And we know only too well that too many of the people with the bioinformatics skills that only made this actually possible are hidden in the middle of the authorship, and everybody thinks they're just padding. You know, the first author is a really important person, and the last author is, wow, this even more important person, because they're on the end of all the papers, and they turn up time and time again. And frankly, it's nonsense. It's a good way of science filling up the library, as I've said for many years, but it doesn't actually do much good for anybody. And I think it's about time that we really change this attitude, that we recognize that the people in the middle are absolutely essential for all of these big data studies. And until the leading academics in this country and elsewhere actually change their minds and stop thinking that putting their name at the end of a paper is the most important thing they can do, actually doing something useful might turn out to be even more important.
Just had a question in response to that myself. Are there penalties for those who don't share within the stipulated timeframes? You know, do we have the right balance of carrots and sticks in this?
If nobody complains, then there's nobody to get, sticked, treated, or carroted either. So I think it is up to the community to make an effort. Because if you want things to change, you have to be proactive, and you have to speak up and say it's not good enough.
There's one comment behind you, and then John is next.
Yes, so maybe also another feedback again from the psychiatric world that I'm usually dealing with. And speaking of the incentive, I think so there are also two different levels also of sharing these raw genotypes here, and I think we have to distinguish this a little bit, I think, so especially if you get back reward and incentives. So there's this level that I find is pretty extreme. It's like UK Biobank that's actually, or also like dbGaP and EGA, so that are sharing these genotypes actually to every researcher who wants to work with the data. And this is this example that you meant also, like there's a bioinformatics person who just takes the data and just gets all the credit for that. In our psychiatric world, there's something that we do a little bit differently, and I think this might get back to this question about incentives. So what we're doing here, we're collecting all these raw genotypes in a central place, just ourselves. This has nothing to do with dbGaP or sharing this with, and then we share it amongst ourselves. So meaning this whole consortium, and this is this incentive. So if you share your raw genotypes with us, then you get access to all other raw genotypes as well that are in this community. For that, this has nothing to do with like some researchers getting some access who didn't contribute to it. So everybody has to contribute its own data, and then you get access to really beautiful data sets. And this led to this point that really many people are really working with the data. We have a specific system for that, like secondary analysis proposals, blah, 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 et cetera, and so on. But just this could be one of these incentives, that there's an internal sharing process that makes it like accessible for everybody, and this sometimes helps a lot. I have the feeling in our community this works very, very well, to be honest.
I probably could add to that, just to add up to your point, because it's not only data which you can get, but also bioinformatics expertise which you get from your group. Because you also impute data, process data, advise on quality controls, and when other people accessing other people's data, it's already unified and processed. I think it's a very good example which you have just made.
John, wait patiently.
A few things. The first thing is the MLC and the welcome may indeed tell you have to share data, but they really don't fund you doing that. Let me just say that, folks. So, I mean, you know, it's nice to be told to do things, but you know, when we've generated gene expression data, and in the old array data, the funding finished 3 years ago, but I get asked questions about people accessing the data and telling me that the website is down, or how do I do this, or what do I do about that, or I think there's a mistake in your data, and I get a couple of those every week, and I can't deal with them, and I'm not funded to deal with them. So, you know, it's what we call an unfunded mandate. Yeah. Data sharing is usually an unfunded mandate. I do have some sympathy for what Jerry said earlier. The ADSP, the sequencing data from the States is indeed freely available, and it's not fair that the European data is not freely available. I absolutely agree with him about that. It's very difficult because we're dealing with very complex ethics, and it only needs one data set to not allow sharing for us to be totally stuffed in terms of sharing, and it's really not fair. On the other hand, you know, the Americans have funded about 20 times more than the Europeans, so it's only one of many unfair things in the world. That's enough. I've got other complaints too, but that'll do.
Hi, this is Giovanna Lali from the Wellcome Trust, Neuroscience and Mental Health. Thank you, John. Yes, in terms of funding data sharing, of course, as you, Perry, also was mentioning, yes, we have our box in our grant proposals about data sharing protocols. What are you going to do to ensure that your data is shared? And I mean, obviously the referees and also the interview panels take care in that. In fact, we had several cases where, you know, people who were successful at the interview stage had to wait and come back with a reasonable explanation before we award the actual amount of money. However, for us, as you can imagine, it's practically impossible realistically to check whether everybody can share the data. I agree with you, so it's up also to the scientific community to come back to us and complain if this doesn't happen. In terms of sustainability of sharing resources, of course, we also offer bioresource schemes to try to really develop websites or data sharing storage systems for resources that can be shared, that can have a wide impact on the scientific community. It's very difficult to fund everything, of course, and we try our best to provide whatever is possible, sometimes in partnerships with other funding organizations, but especially the long-term viability of these resources is something that we should worry about. Whether if there are some key resources and platforms, for example, for data sharing where we can contribute. So this is something that, for example, you could definitely be interested in supporting.
Can I just ask? I was surprised that you mentioned complaints. Have you not received complaints about data sharing in your experience?
Not in the 5 years that I was.
Not in the 5 years.
Chair of the neuroscience board, first of science. So there was not a single
instead of having a box to tick, would it be useful to have, instead of just a box, to be specific about...
Oh no, that you have to fill in the box. I mean, the box is so big and it says, I will do X, Y, and Z with the data and I will make it available in this format, and if there's not enough detail, then it comes back in. But I have sympathy with what John's saying, of course, is the more you develop it, then more cost and time and so forth. But there's nothing to stop you applying for money to do that. I mean, more and more people, in my experience, were applying for money to disseminate their data to the public or whatever. So there's nothing to stop people doing that, as far as I'm aware.
Just very briefly also, we have an entire priority area that is actually dedicated to open research. So if you have some interesting ideas or for projects, etc., that enables data sharing for wider community, you should come in contact, should get in touch with us.
So just one thought here. Maybe, since this issue about carrots and sticks brought up, maybe it should be that, or one thought to consider, that within grants that it's made clear that sort of on a performance-related pay sort of a scheme, that as you share, you get a supplement to your grant. So rather than just make a protestation, each time you share in some meaningful way, the MRC or the Welcome give you a little extra supplement, and it depends, and it could be on a sort of performance-related pay basis.
Similarly, I'd been thinking this will apply to those involved with UK universities and institutions. There's the REF Impact 2021 coming up. I'm not sure if, data sharing and impact had through submissions to public repositories, etc., is part of that. Should it be?
Well, I've just been this morning. I had to go to a briefing on our UCL's mock ref. The amount of time that all this will consume is mind-boggling. But once again, it's reiterated a bit about the point about being first or last. Was that if we think that it will matter if there are more than 6 authors, if you're not first or last, you have to explain what you might have contributed to that paper. So you can immediately see where the credit for a piece of work is going to, you won't have to justify if you were the first or last. Maybe we should get rid of first and last and we just have a...
We used to have a system in the pharmacology of alphabetical, always, all authors were alphabetical.
I mean, sort of iPods and things always have a shuffle thing, so you could have it so that it's randomly generated and each time, no, so that may not be quite the best.
So before I try to pitch one more question into the rest of the hour, it just occurred to me that it might be worth thinking back in history for a decade or so to just remember how much I think is to be gained from large-scale data sharing in genetics. Remember back in the early 90s, the dementia field, or AD at least, had ApoE and the 3 autosomal dominant genes. Schizophrenia had some drugs that were found empirically that had no genes. Schizophrenia geneticists tried, couldn't get any genes. There was really no progress in schizophrenia genetics for a long time. So maybe for that reason, in part, they built a consortium that shares data more broadly. And now, 10, 15 years forward, there is a huge amount of information, and there were a lot of findings, lots of variants. So the AD field has maybe 30 genes and a bunch of variants in them. But maybe it could be argued that schizophrenia research did very well with trying to solve some of these challenges we discuss here today and sharing data even more broadly than dementia research is doing dementia genetics is doing at this point. But on this note, I'd like to ask you, the panel and all of you, imagine for a moment that you had free rein to create the ideal publicly available data set, or with some qualified access, if we're talking raw data, for dementia research or diagnostics? You know, what would it be? Does it exist already in another field and could be emulated? If you could have the perfect genetics database, what would it be? Valentina.
Well, for me,
for your work,
all data possible in the world, all genotyped, unified, imputed in one platform, all together, and clinical information and lifestyle information for everything possible, everybody. And then I would run algorithms which could find subgroups of people based upon their genetics and their phenotypic whatever information, so multivariate, and that solves the problems.
And the controls are all aged controls.
Well, controls-wise, I mean, in dementia area, we don't know what controls are. You can argue if one lives long enough, you will develop it sooner or later. It's just a different subgroup which I will identify for you.
Anyone else? Ideal database? Does it already exist somewhere?
That doesn't exist now.
I'd like the same database as Valentina, but with only me having access.
So we have a few more minutes. We could try another one. So from a technical perspective, what is needed to store and share raw data? You know, is there, can we envision somebody else to make and host such a database?
Again,
would it be an academic medical center? Would it be a coalition?
I think technically it's actually possible already. There are platforms like clouds or high-performance computing which would allow to store and host and give access, secure access to all, whatever, to my fantasy database. I mean, I think technical problem is not, not biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is agreement between institution, funding bodies, and to share the data, yes, taking into account all different countries' regulations, clinical regulations, I don't know, that is a real problem, not the technical one.
So on that note, is there any experience or interest with these federated systems? In Alzheimer's, for example, there's the GAIN database that has overcome the difficulties with different regulations in different countries about sharing data, maintaining data, different institutional requirements. They have overcome this by building a system that they call a federated system, where all the data stays in its original location, and users VPN in, they port in basically to do analyses, and they wrote some APIs to make that possible, so none of the data actually leaves the original institution where it was generated, but it is still being made available to a much larger group of also qualified scientists for analyses. Could something like that be useful for genetic data to at least sidestep national and institutional differences in rules and regulations? Jerry, are you trying to say something? Hold up the microphone.
Sure.
Yeah.
So dbGaP stopped accepting large files. So NIA funded NIAGADS, which is at the University of Pennsylvania, to replace dbGaP for large sequencing files and genotyping files. And we will roll this out in another month or 2 to 3 months, sometime in the near future. And it'll be an online mechanism you apply. You still have to get your own IRB to approve that you are qualified to have that data. Once you get access to it, you go online, you pick out the data set, and all the data are on Amazon, and then you'll have to set up your own Amazon account, but then the data will be transferred from our account to your account. You're free to work. We hope people work with it on Amazon because they don't have to spend the time and effort to put it up there, or they can download it to their own computer, and if they do it on Amazon and they're done with it, they delete it. You know, the storage costs are gone. So that's a way of sharing these large files like CRAMs to people that want to use it, and it's qualified access. It's going to hopefully be easier than dbGaP, but you'll get real raw data.
Julie.
I mean, we're attempting to do something similar, but on a smaller scale, I suppose, with DPUK, with the platform. I mean, the platform is there for epidemiological samples, and the raw data will be on the platform. You have to apply through, for the usual checks, that you're a scientist and you have ethical approval, etc., etc. But the ambition is to have access to the raw data and perhaps have multiple data sets within epidemiology. We're just beginning to do something with the genetics. So we are putting our data on that platform, and you also have the biobank data that is accessible to most. But there is a possibility then that you could use that platform to store genetic raw data. Again, you could have access through whichever group had put their data on there. Those sorts of issues are common. But I think it is feasible. It's something that we certainly want to do. But the problem is that cost us several, probably a couple of £100,000
So it needs to be funded.
Get the software written specifically for our data sets. So it's money. So if the field wants this to happen, they need to put money into that. I think it would be an excellent idea.
I think on that note, we'll close the session so as not to cut too much into Saskia Biskup's talk. I thank the panel. I thank all of you for your thoughtful comments, and I'm sure the topic is to be continued.